In today's tutorial, I'm going to go over my process for the Rabbat painting. This was a piece I painted for Let's Draw Monsters, which is a creature design challenge hosted by Justin Gerard and myself. We hope to do one of these each month. I'm working on a 10 by 8 inch panel that has been primed with Golden's black gesso. I'm using Vasari oil paints to start, mostly because they are very opaque and I want to start this painting with some pigmented colors that stand out really boldly on the panel. The color I'm putting down now is called Shiprock, mixed with a little adobe. Shiprock is a really nice warm neutral tone, and adobe is similar to a yellow ochre. I'm just trying to lay this in as quickly as possible. I want to get this background base down before I start adding my clouds. I'm working with a wide, soft, synthetic bristle brush, and I'm using long, sweeping strokes to cover the board. I want the paint application to be as smooth as possible, especially since I do plan on painting a figure over this layer. Next, I'm going to introduce a color that I really love called Vice, that's a really bright sky blue. It's been mixed with adobe to give it a soft teal color. I'm going to be working on this painting from background to foreground, and then I'll add the figure in last. I thought about adding my sketch onto the panel first and then painting around it, but whenever I have a figure set against a background like a sky, I feel like it looks more natural if I'm not having to worry about accidentally covering up my lines. I think for me, it's actually faster just to do it this way. But if this was a painting that was larger than 10 by 8 inches, I would probably rethink this a bit. You might find that your execution will change depending on the size and subject you're painting. The color I've been adding to the top here is called Silver Point, which is a dusky grayish blue. I'm going to keep blending all of the pigment out until my transitions are smooth. I'm purposefully leaving out that top right corner because I think I'm going to be painting a tree there, and I just want to see how I feel about that area being darker against the sky. If we make it a bit further along and I decide that I don't like it, it will be easy to blend the paint out to fill that space. I'm going to mix in some Old Holland Payne's Gray to the top just to darken it a little. You'll notice that when looking at a landscape, the sky is always brighter towards the horizon and darker towards the top. And that is because of an effect called Rayleigh scattering, which basically refers to the scattering of light off of the molecules in the air. I'm going to keep that dark to light gradient in mind as I'm adding my pigment here. A lot is going to change once I start painting the clouds, but I think it's good just to keep some of these principles in mind while working on a landscape. Next, I'm going to start adding a suggestion of the horizon using my Silver Point mixed with a little Payne's Gray. I'm not worrying about being too precise yet, I just want to map it out right now. Because of atmospheric perspective, the things in the far distant background are going to take on more of the subtle tones from the sky. And as you get closer, the elements in the foreground will appear more vibrant and stark. I'm mixing in some raw umber to my pigment here to get an idea of how I'm going to want my color to shift to reflect those principles. So I think I have enough here to go ahead and start adding some clouds. I've been using a new white paint called Griffin Alkyd White by Winsor Newton that's a fast-drying paint. Sometimes with the fast-drying Alkyd Whites, I find that the glazes don't like to adhere to them. This is the first Alkyd White that I have not had that problem. I'm just dabbing the white directly onto the background now. It's mixing with the pigment I have down already. I want to accentuate the billowing shapes of the clouds. I'm going to have them lit by moonlight, and I'm planning for the moon to be towards the right of the painting, which is why I'm adding my brightest points on the right side of the clouds. I can add a little Payne's gray for the shadows. This alkyd white dries so quickly that these areas might be dry by this evening, which would be perfect because I'm really eager to finish the background and start on the figure. I'm adding a little nickel titanium yellow in with my white for the peaks of my clouds. I'm using a 1/8 inch angled shader for these smaller details. I like working wet on wet for skies because I want a little bit of push and pull while I'm adding my paint. The colors are mixing themselves right onto the board. If you're going to work this way, it's important to have a really soft touch so you don't accidentally lift the paint you already put down, especially when you're working on a dark background like this. You can see how I'm adding really short, quick strokes with my small angled shader, and then buffing it out with a larger, softer brush and a gentle dabbing motion. See how the paint is blending ever so slightly, but for the most part, my pigment is staying put. It's important not to thin your paint for the first few layers of the painting for archival reasons. I know if I had used an oil paint medium like walnut oil too early in this process, my paint would be lifting up right now, and you would be seeing the black board peeking through. As a quick test, I want to see how my Payne's gray will look against the sky when I start adding foliage. I might have to introduce some darker pigments to make the leaves stand out a bit more. I think it's mixing with the background a little too much, but I'm going to work on the mountains first before starting on the trees, since the trees are going to be overlapping a lot of these areas. Just like with my clouds, I'm going to take the angled shader and dab some bright highlights onto the board. I recently took a trip to Utah for the Fantastic Arts Conference, where we got to see some beautiful snowy mountain ranges. I'm only going to take these mountains to about 25% completion right now. I'll detail them a bit further once I get my trees in. I don't want to go crazy working on them now in case I end up covering up most of them with the trees. Plus, I plan on my figure being positioned near the middle of the board, which is right about where those mountain ranges are. So for these leaves, I'm going to try out a few different colors to see what works best. I'm using a peacock green from Old Holland, but it's really light, so I'm mixing in some green umber and black. That combination seems to work really well. I love using angled shaders for tree leaves. The brush is doing all of the hard work and I just have to dab. They're also good for painting lines as well. I'm going to use it for adding these long tree trunks. For the smaller branches, I find that a pointed round brush works better for fine details. Okay, we've waited long enough. Let's just see what a tree would look like in our dark right corner. I like that this tree seems like it's a bit closer to the foreground than the other one. It's easier for these leaves to be darker as well, since I left the bulk of this area unpainted. My brush strokes aren't mixing with the background as much, like they were with the tree on the left. Since this tree is going to be closer to the foreground, I'm also going to introduce some more reds into my green leaves. My background is so blue, I think that by adding some reds into the foreground, I help further separate my spatial planes. I'm using burnt umber, which is both a fast dryer and very opaque. Next, I'm going to paint a lake into the bottom part of the painting. I want to add the lake especially so that I'll have something for the moon to reflect off of. I'm using nickel titanium yellow to block it in. I'm keeping in mind the direction of where the ripples would be in the water. You can see how I'm dragging my brush from left to right in a sweeping motion. I can introduce a little peacock green as I work my way down. Now I know I don't have my moon painted in just yet, but I'm going to go ahead and dab on some nickel titanium yellow where I imagine the moon's light will be reflected. My paint is kind of thick because, as I blend it out from left to right, it's pulling the pigment across the lake, giving the illusion of little ripples in the water. I'm going to do this again with my alkyd white. Dab the color on, and then blend it with a sweeping motion. I love how it just delicately drags the paint across the surface of the board. Now that I have the lake basically blocked in, I can think about adding some distant trees and shrubs into the background. As I move inland, I'm going to switch to a lighter pigment so the shapes stand out against the dark background. I'm still keeping in mind where my light source is coming from. I know just the very tips of the foliage here will be highlighted by the moonlight. I'm going to brighten up my foreground foliage as well, using my pointed round brush to dot in some leaves. I'm using the same colors as I was for the lake, peacock green mixed with a little titanium yellow. With my angled shader, I'm going to focus on the left side of the painting now. I'm just dabbing in some raw umber mixed with titanium yellow to create my terrain here. I'm going to dot in where I would imagine the leaves would be reflecting the moonlight. Unfortunately, this step always ruins the tips of my pointed round brushes. Thankfully, I can repurpose them later for softening sharp lines or use them for creating interesting textures. It's fun to imagine all of the tiny hills and valleys and hidden places while painting in the ground here. Since this landscape is going to be the home of a creature, I like to think about how he would actually live in a landscape such as this. I'm also trying to hold back from getting too much detail in the background here, since this is not going to be the main focus of my painting. I still need to add my figure into the piece. So now that I've done a full detail pass over the painting, I'm going to revisit the lake and add my final specular highlights. I'm painting with my Griffin alkyd white now. I still haven't painted the moon because I'm going to base its position on where I end up putting these highlights. If you've ever seen a body of water that's reflecting a bright light source, you'll notice how there are so many points of light that seem to scatter all over the surface. I just want to be sure that I've added enough that it gives the illusion of a shiny surface with small ripples. So the last thing I'm going to do here is finally paint in the moon. I'll probably clean up the shape a bit after this is all dried, but for now I just want to put a circular shape down. And then finally I can add some rim lighting to my clouds. So that is pretty much it for this part of the tutorial. The background here was painted in one pass, but I'm going to wait for everything to dry before I paint my Rabbat, which is a half rabbit, half bat. I'll link that tutorial below. As always, I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any suggestions for new tutorials, please let me know in the comments below. I've had some really good suggestions recently that I'm going to try to shoot next month. Also, I hope you guys are all staying safe and healthy during the crisis the world is facing right now. Your support means so much to me, and I'm keeping all of you and your families in my thoughts. I just hope this is all over soon, so stay safe. Until next time, bye.